Morning light cut the lab windows like a verdict. I had just told the truth about data fabrication. My own team had stitched the numbers to sell a prettier story, and the room exhaled in a chorus. Traitor, liar, outcast. The board let me hear the consequences in one breath, and in the next, my name disappeared from the project. My reputation shredded. And then, because the rest of the world loves a cruel joke, my family added its own verdict to the record. This ridiculous dream of urban beekeeping and city restoration is an embarrassment you'll grow out of. I stood in the doorway of a life that suddenly felt rented, a dream that felt dangerous to admit in the same breath as a brutal dismissal. They told me I'd fail. They told me I was ridiculous. They were wrong about the dream, and wrong about me. That was the moment the ledger opened. The moment I decided the pain would be the instrument, not the ornament. Painful departure and relentless pursuit. I walked away with a suitcase full of data that would go stale in a year, with a heart that sounded like a hammer in a silent room. I didn't know what I'd become, only what I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be the easy, quiet daughter of a family that believed in safety above all else. They'd mocked the dream long before the betrayal. Beekeeping in a city, restoration through a handful of hives on old factories. A ridiculous effort to coax life from cracked pavement. A hobby, my father had sneered, not a livelihood. Embarrassment, my sister had whispered with a smile that felt like a cut. So I started again where no one cared to look. Rooftops, balcony rails, vacant lots, listening for a hum that meant something more than buzz. If the data I'd exposed could be weaponized against me, I'd weaponize the city's silence into something that would answer for me with living proof. I learned the city's pulse through bees. I learned its patience through pollinators returning to life where it mattered most, where people walked past desert sidewalks and never expected to see a meadow, where a few hives could turn a street into a corridor of green. The first year was a lean prayer. 9 fragile hives on a sun-baked warehouse roof. A skeptic's shrug, a janitor's curious smile. I faced scorn again, the bold chorus echoing in the alleys. Beekeeping in a metropolis? You'll starve. But the stubbornness in me wasn't a flare, it was a flame. I studied the city's heat, its wind tunnels, the way pollen drifted through cracked concrete like seeds of hope. I built a tiny ecosystem out of discarded callets and rain barrels. I mapped pollinator pathways the way others mapped crime stats, and I turned data into something human, an honest dashboard that showed bee health, plant diversity, and human health rising in tandem. The ridicule never stopped. Not completely, but it began to look smaller. People, neighbors, taxi drivers, even a few city planners started to look up when the hives hummed on a rooftop, and the night sky lit with the soft glow of a street-long garden coming alive. Arduous ascension and profound triumph. The road to proof is never straight, and mine twisted through storms of doubt and bureaucracy. Zoning boards asked for noise studies. Scientists accused me of focusing on novelties rather than outcomes. Investors asked where the return would come from, when the bees themselves seemed to offer only whispers and weather. I learned to tell a broader story. This wasn't about beekeeping as a spectacle. It was about ecological restoration in a block-sized theater. I showed how urban pollinator corridors could revive not just bees, but fruit trees, tomatoes, peppers, the tiny miracles that fed a street with flavor and color. The data, once a weapon used to smear me, became a bridge to collaboration. Citizen scientists gathered local data on flowering times. Schools brought kids to observe hive activity. Restaurateurs noticed longer seasons for herbs and peppers as pollination improved. With a seed grant, I expanded to a network of rooftops, then vacant lots, then public parks reclaimed from neglect. I designed modular hives with sensors that tracked hive health, temperature, and humidity. The dashboards fed. The work didn't just restore pollinators, it restored trust. Neighbors who once wheeled past in chrome-laden indifference began to ask for beekeeping workshops. A local developer funded a greenway that stitched together 3 decaying blocks into a living corridor. Even the skeptical researchers who'd once smeared me came to see that the data's truth could be beautiful when it lived in public, tangible change. Monumental success wasn't a solitary triumph, it was a chorus. Schools, businesses, families, and city departments learning to listen to the hum of a healthy ecosystem and let that hum steer decisions. I learned a deeper truth that crossed all the lines that had once separated me from my own family. The field of triumph is not to flaunt how wrong they were, but to reveal a shared future that was always possible if we dared to act. The universal lesson tucked in every bloom, every nectar trail, every bee-warded street is simple and stubborn. Change obeys patience, and patience is a form of courage. Cathartic return and poetic justice. Years later, I returned to the town, where I'd learned every shade of scorn. They stood at the edge of a plaza, where I'd organized a public demonstration of the city's new ecology, a living map of restoration. Pollinator gardens along the river, rooftop hives glittering in the afternoon light, kids chasing bees with the curiosity I'd once chased myself. And there they were, my family, older, trained by time to expect disappointment where I'd promised renewal. They watched as I stepped onto a small stage built between 2 beehives, a banner behind me reading, "Urban Ecology, Urban Hope." When I finished speaking, a hush fell over the crowd. Then the first toe tap of genuine astonishment, the crowd's warmth, the nods from neighbors who recognized me, the way a grandmother's eyes grew moist as she remembered the gardens she'd once whispered about from her porch. It wasn't just me who had changed. The city had learned to believe again, and the family finally faced the echo of their past derision in the light of what I'd become. My father, who used to call this dream a joke, stepped forward with a tremor in his voice I hadn't heard in years. "We misjudged your courage," he admitted, careful not to look at me as if I were a spectacle, but as if I were a future he'd once doubted. My mother, eyes glistening, whispered, "We should have trusted you to walk the path you felt drawn to." The shame in their voices wasn't a weapon, but a confession, a release of years' worth of guilt that had sat on them like a stone. And then the moment that felt like a ledger closing and reopening somewhere kinder. I invited them to walk through the garden, to watch the bees pour from hive to flower, to hear the soft chatter of a city learning to listen again. They saw the barren street transformed into a living corridor. They understood that derision can harden the heart or soften it if you let reality do its work. The latter is the kinder fate. The city hums now with a quiet, confident energy, a chorus of voices that agreed to try. As the sun settled, I spoke to them not as a prodigal who had proven them wrong, but as a neighbor who had proven a future possible. The karma's ledger I'd carried all that time didn't punish them for their cruelty. It allowed them to pay with their new understanding, to replace derision with interest, to trade scorn for mentorship, to exchange old judgments for new beginnings. The neighborhood cheered for the work, and so did I. I learned to tell the truth with a steady, hopeful voice. My dream wasn't to overshadow their doubts, but to rewrite the map so a city could breathe. I learned that betrayal isn't the end, but a prompt to discover a deeper purpose. I learned that the bees don't just pollinate flowers, they pollinate courage in human hearts. The landing wasn't easy, but it was true. And truth, in the end, is the only currency that never collapses. And so I keep tending the city's hum, one hive, one garden, one hopeful street at a time. If you listen closely, you'll hear the quiet triumph of a dream that refused to die, the patient arithmetic of resilience, turning the impossible into a living, breathing home. The ledger has closed, and what remains is a future where the promise of a ridiculous dream becomes the city's most vital truth.